Hello, whisperers. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy tonight's tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps more than you know. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's story. The cold hit different when we stepped out of the truck, and it wasn't the sharp kind we felt in Montana or the heavy kind we fought through in Kansas. It crept in slow, seeping under the collar of my coat and settling deep in my bones like it had been waiting for us. Dalton kept his collar pulled tight and muttered into it as he walked beside me, not quite complaining, but clearly thinking about turning around. Mercer moved ahead without saying anything, letting his flashlight drag a thin beam across the overgrown road that led into Briar Ridge. The snow on the ground hadn't fallen recently, but it hadn't melted either, and the way it clung to everything made the place feel like it hadn't allowed the season to pass. "Feels like this town didn't let the season go," Dalton said quietly. His rifle was slung across his chest, and while his voice stayed level, his grip on the strap was tight enough to crease the leather. I didn't answer because I wasn't convinced the air itself wasn't listening. There was a pressure hanging over the place, thick and humming, like walking into static. We didn't see any lights in the distance, no chimneys letting off smoke, no parked cars half buried in snow, just the road unwinding between skeletal trees and dead farmland, taking us deeper into what was left of Briar Ridge. At the edge of town, the welcome sign lay face down in a snowbank. Mercer flipped it over, revealing 4 perfectly spaced, rounded dents pressed deep into the wood, too precise to be from boots or tire chains. Dalton brushed more snow aside and froze when he saw the last dent, which wasn't really a dent at all but a puncture, as if something had stabbed downward with exact force. He stood slowly. "This isn't animal work." Mercer gave a grim nod. "No, it's not." As we walked farther in, the silence grew heavier. It wasn't the normal quiet of a rural town in winter. It felt intentional, manufactured, like sound had seeped out of the place and left it hollow. My boots crunched through frozen slush that should have melted days ago given the temperature. But something about this town was holding everything still. They changed this place, I thought. Whatever they are, they changed it. The first house we reached had its front door torn off, not kicked, not smashed, but torn in one smooth motion that left the hinge plates perfectly intact. The door itself lay 10 feet away in the yard, half buried in frost. Dalton stepped through the threshold and froze, calling us inside with a tone even he couldn't hide the unease from. The living room wasn't ransacked. It looked dissected. Every chair, every cushion, every piece of wood was split open with surgical precision and arranged into tidy piles on the floor. On the far wall, family photographs were pinned in a perfectly aligned grid, using thin metal needles none of us recognized. Underneath the photos, carved into the drywall, were 4 long parallel lines, straight, clean, identical in length. Mercer leaned close and traced the spacing with his eyes. 4 digits, he murmured. Same pattern as the sign. Dalton swallowed hard. "So, fingers?" Mercer didn't respond. A drag mark cut through the dust on the floorboards and continued through the kitchen toward the back door. The door itself wasn't broken or torn. It was simply gone, as if lifted cleanly out of the frame. The yard behind the house was worse. Snow was disturbed in a wide spiral pattern, radiating out from a central point where a neatly folded stack of clothing sat on the ground. Shirt, pants, socks, shoes. No blood, no body. Just empty clothes arranged as if the owner had disappeared mid-motion. Dalton stared for a long moment, shaking his head. That's not how things disappear. That's not anything I know. Mercer crouched and examined the snow. No footprints leaving, no sign of a struggle, no collapse. They weren't dragged. So what happened? Dalton asked. Mercer dusted his gloves and rose. They were taken straight up. I looked at the sky. It was an empty canopy of dark, no clouds, no stars, nothing to indicate height or distance, just a blankness that felt wrong. Dalton exhaled slowly. I really hate when you say things like that. We kept moving house to house, each one worse than the last. One had every window pane removed without a single crack. Another had the entire second floor missing, the ceiling cut smooth like someone erased the upper half of the building with a single careful motion. But nothing hit as hard as the house on Pine Hollow Lane. We smelled it before we saw it, a metallic sweetness with a stale edge that made the air taste thick. The bodies inside were arranged in a circle. 6 adults, pale and intact except for their chests, each of which was punctured inward with a precision that made my skin crawl. Their eyes and mouths hung open as if frozen mid-breath. There was no blood pooled, no signs of panic, just bodies drained and hollowed. Dalton stepped back toward the door, shaking his head. I can't even describe this. Mercer studied the bodies with a quiet that felt heavier than the room. This is harvesting. I looked at him. Harvesting what? Whatever they needed, he said. We stumbled back outside, desperate for air despite how wrong the cold felt against our faces. The temperature had dropped sharply, a sudden bite that didn't match the hour. I scanned the sky again, but the dark above us remained still and oppressive. Dalton stopped suddenly. Luke, what is that? Behind the elementary school on the ridge stood a tall, needle-like metal structure. Pale lights pulsed up its length in slow, rhythmic intervals. The thing hummed with a frequency that vibrated in my teeth. Mercer approached cautiously, eyes narrowed. That wasn't here during the last satellite pass. They built this recently. Dalton's voice wavered. Why here? Why a place like Briar Ridge? Mercer exhaled. Because no one reports screams in a town people already forgot existed. The structure pulsed again, once, twice, 3 times. The hum deepened. Snow blew sideways, though there was no wind. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something clicked, rapid, insect-like, and moved through the trees with disturbing speed. We weren't alone, and Briar Ridge was only beginning to show us what it was hiding. The night didn't fall so much as collapse. It felt like the darkness folded over the town and smothered what little safety daylight pretended to offer. The air got heavier, thick enough that each breath tasted metallic, like cold pennies pressed against the tongue. I remember thinking the quiet was going to break, and I hate that I was right. Dalton walked ahead of me between the ruined houses, his rifle held tight against his chest while he scanned every roofline. He tried to appear calm, but his shoulders were wound tight, and his eyes kept darting to the higher branches of the trees. Mercer brought up the rear, favoring his left side after slipping earlier, but still alert in that steady way of his. I kept seeing the crater in my mind. Whatever crawled out of it wasn't lost, or confused, or adjusting. It was hunting. We found the first survivor in an overturned shed behind a farm equipment lot. A teenage boy huddled under a tarp, shaking so hard the metal siding rattled with every tremor of his body. He couldn't talk at first, just stared past us like he was waiting for something else to appear behind our shoulders. When he finally managed words, they came out in broken fragments about lights in the fog, something peeling open the silo roof, and his father being lifted too fast to scream. Dalton tried to calm him, but the kid's voice kept cracking until Mercer put a firm hand on his arm and moved us along. We were halfway to the elementary school when we heard the first chittering. It started above us, a rapid-fire clicking that rolled along the rooftops like tapping fingers. I felt the hair on my arms rise because the pattern wasn't random. It shifted from house to house in perfect succession, as if something was signaling its packmates across the neighborhood. Dalton raised his rifle at the eaves and whispered something I didn't catch. I didn't need the words. His face said enough. The first gray dropped onto the road in front of us without making a sound. Its limbs were wiry and too long, as if something stretched the joints until they were ready to rip free. The skin had that slick, pale sheen like it had never been touched by sunlight. Its eyes were the worst part, black, reflective, and flat like whetstones lodged in its skull. It tilted its head once, the motion too smooth to feel natural. Then it launched forward with a burst of speed that made my heart stutter. Dalton fired first, and the shot punched through the creature's shoulder in a spray of dark fluid. It barely flinched. The impact pivoted its torso, but its legs kept moving with mechanical precision. I stepped in and fired twice more, hitting its ribs and hip. The gray staggered, body collapsing in jerky motions like a puppet with half-cut strings, before it rolled onto its back and scrambled upright again. Mercer slammed the butt of his rifle into its head, and the creature folded at last, limbs twitching long after it stopped breathing. We didn't get a chance to breathe. Something scraped across the nearest barn roof, and the entire structure shuddered as another gray peeled the tin sheeting back with delicate ease. The metal curled upward like a soup can lid under a can opener. I saw its fingers hook under the hedge with long, needle-like precision. There was no wasted movement, no struggle, just an alien pulling open the world in front of it as if nothing had weight. A scream cut through the cold, sharp and frantic, coming from the cornfield behind the barn. We ran before thinking, boots slapping frozen mud, breath cutting in thin white threads ahead of us. The rows of corn were brittle skeletons of themselves, each stalk dry and rattling in the wind like loose bones. A woman stumbled between them, half falling as she tried to outrun something hidden in the shadows. Her coat was shredded down the back, and one sleeve hung by a thread as she clawed her way toward us. We didn't see the gray until it rose behind her in a smooth, sinuous motion. It grabbed her ankles, dragging her backward through the stalks as she twisted and kicked. Dalton reached her first and grabbed her wrist, but the creature yanked her with a strength that almost pulled him off his feet. Mercer moved in and drove his boot into the alien's elbow joint, forcing its grip to break long enough for Dalton to haul the woman upright. She sobbed against his chest while the gray rolled away into the dark, its limbs contorting as it vanished between the rows. We managed to get the woman into a garage a block away, only to stop short at what was inside. 6 bodies lay arranged in a perfect circle on the concrete floor. Their limbs were placed neatly at their sides, and their chests were caved inward with terrifying precision. No blood pooled around them. No signs of panic or struggle marked the floor. It felt more like something studied them rather than killed them. Dalton whispered that we needed to leave, but Mercer crouched to examine one of the corpses. He touched the collapsed sternum with gloved fingers and inhaled sharply. The imprint matched the puncture wounds from the farmhouse photos. This wasn't random carnage. It was a method, a routine, a system. We didn't get time to analyze it. The vents in the garage floor vibrated, thin sheets of dust rising off the concrete in trembling ripples. I turned in time to see a gray's eyes appear between the slats, reflecting our flashlights back at us. Before I could lift my rifle, the creature lunged upward, its arm shooting through the vent opening, fingers snapping inches from Dalton's leg. Dalton stumbled backward and fell against a workbench, knocking tools across the floor in a metallic rain. I grabbed his collar and dragged him out as Mercer stomped the vent grate back down, pinning the alien's arm. The gray thrashed beneath the metal, its fingers spasming wildly until they snapped at the knuckles. Even then, the severed pieces twitched like they had thoughts of their own. Outside, the chittering grew louder. It surrounded us like a cage of sound, rising and falling in coordinated pulses. I could feel the rhythm of it, the way each note lined up with another somewhere else. There were dozens now, maybe more. We ran for the old diner at the center of town, hoping the heavy appliances inside might buy us a minute or two of safety. But the grays hit us before we reached the parking lot. One dropped from a telephone pole, landing on Mercer and sending both of them crashing into a drift of icy snow. Another sprinted on all fours across the street, closing 12 feet in the blink of an eye. Dalton swung the barrel of his rifle like a bat, catching the creature in the jaw and sending it spinning through the slush. I grabbed Mercer under the arms and dragged him upright, blood spreading across his side where the gray had slashed him. The wound wasn't deep, but it was precise, too precise. Every cut we'd seen tonight looked like it came from a surgeon who wanted to work fast. We pushed forward while the aliens regrouped, their chittering turning sharper, more focused, almost angry. They weren't just chasing us. They were communicating, planning, learning our patterns the same way a wolf pack tests fences before leaping them. We made it to the diner only because the grays allowed it. I felt that in my bones. They weren't finished with us, not by a long shot, and the bodies we found were only the beginning. The survivors we wanted to rescue were dwindling by the minute, and the creatures were closing in from every direction. Mercer pressed a hand to his ribs and looked at me with a grim steadiness. "They're not hunting this town anymore," he said quietly. "They're hunting us." Dalton swallowed hard. "Then we'd better not give them an easy kill." The chittering surged outside, crawling up the walls and vibrating the windows. The night was far from over, and the grays were only getting bolder. The sky above Briar Ridge looked bruised when morning should have been coming, the kind of muddy violet that never quite becomes daylight. I knew then that whatever was happening out here wasn't stopping with the bodies we'd found or the things we'd shot. The grays had clustered around the crater in the field at the far end of town, moving in a slow, circling rhythm that didn't feel like guarding or hunting. It felt like waiting, and the waiting made me nervous in a way bullets never had. We crept along a split-rail fence until we had a view of the crater, and the sight of it was worse than the smell. The soil around it had collapsed inward, forming a bowl of churned mud, streaked with long finger marks where the grays had crawled up and down. Their bodies moved strange in the half-light, twitching with small, abrupt jerks like puppets with too many strings. Dalton crouched beside me and whispered that they weren't looking outward anymore. They were staring into the crater, heads tilted like something down there was calling to them. Mercer scanned the perimeter and pointed toward the old grain silo behind us. The cylindrical walls were already torn open on one side, leaving metal sheeting curled outward like peeled fruit. He said the height might give us a firing advantage, and I didn't argue. It wasn't a good plan. But when you're facing something that crawls on ceilings and rips doors off hinges, you take the height you can get. We sprinted to the silo while the grays stayed fixated on the crater. Dalton moved first, climbing the ladder up the damaged exterior and taking a position halfway. Mercer and I ducked inside through the ripped metal, boots sinking into spilled grain that felt damp and sticky underfoot. The place reeked of mold and diesel, and the air held that weird static charge again, the kind that made your teeth itch. The first gray broke from the group the moment we opened fire. Its head snapped toward the sound without any sign of surprise, just immediate, calculated response. I shot it through the chest, and it dropped, but didn't stay down long. It clawed its way upright again, wheezing out a clicking shriek that made the others turn in unison. Suddenly, the whole pack rushed us, moving low and fast, sprinting on their palms and the tips of their toes like spiders that had shed everything recognizable. Dalton fired from above, sending shots into the cluster, and several grays folded in jerking spasms. Mercer stabbed one through the throat with a steel fence post he'd grabbed earlier, pushing the body aside as another came through the opening in the wall. Grain poured down like sand as Mercer shoved it back, both of them slipping in the avalanche of kernels that dulled our footsteps and muffled the screams. One gray dropped from the silo roof and landed on my back with surprising weight. Its hand clamped over my nose and mouth, fingers small but impossibly strong, sealing my airway before I could yell. I fell backward, slamming it into the spilled grain, and felt its legs tighten around my ribs. The pressure made my chest throb, and the edges of my vision dimmed fast. I clawed at its arm and finally tore its grip loose enough to suck in air, then jammed my pistol up under its jaw and fired through the skull. The flash lit the silo interior for an instant, revealing 3 more grays crawling up the curved walls like they were weightless. Mercer shouted for Dalton to blind them, and Dalton cracked a flare against the ladder. The sudden red bloom filled the silo with unnatural color, making the grays recoil long enough for us to put rounds into their heads and necks. Their bodies fell in stiff, twitching heaps, thudding into the grain with soft, horrible sounds. Outside, the last of the pack swarmed the crater, not fleeing, but reacting to something below the soil. The ground shuddered with a deep, distant rumble, the kind you feel through your boots before you hear it. The grays backed away from the center, forming a wide ring around the depression. They didn't look afraid of us. They looked afraid of something else, something big, something that moved under the earth like it owned every inch of it. Dalton looked at me with real fear in his eyes, not the usual cracked humor he used to keep himself steady. He said we needed to finish the job before whatever was beneath the crater chose to join the fight. Mercer nodded silently and began walking toward the last cluster of grays. I followed, weapon raised, heart hammering in my throat. We spread out in a shallow arc and opened fire on the remaining aliens. They dropped one by one, each kill quieter than the last, until only the hum of the crater filled the field. Something under the ground rolled again, a slow shift of weight that made small rocks jump and scatter. Dalton asked me if we were staying to see what came out, and I told him no. There were limits to what we were supposed to fight, and whatever was waking up didn't feel like it belonged on any list we'd been briefed on. The helicopter arrived as dawn bruised the sky, rotors kicking up dust and dead stalks from the frozen field. We climbed aboard without speaking, each of us too tired or too shaken to break the silence. On my seat sat a manila folder, the next assignment waiting like a bad habit that kept finding us. Dalton leaned over and muttered that if the pages showed another gray, he was jumping out of the aircraft. I opened the folder anyway, hoping he was wrong. He wasn't. The pictures showed dense Pennsylvania farmland, dotted with collapsed cave systems and long stretches of forest where entire families had vanished without leaving so much as a footprint. Mercer said the area had a history of strange encounters, and Dalton asked why the government didn't just close off the whole state. I closed the folder and told him the truth. They would never close it. They'd just send us. The wind buffeted the helicopter as we left Briar Ridge behind, carrying us toward a new place where something waited in pitch-black caverns. Something with too many legs and the hunger to match.